But leaning into that terraforming conversation, if we did reach another planet, how would we start to make it livable?
It depends on which planet it is, but if you, I mean, in the very far future, you could speculate about planets orbiting other stars, but we just don't have the technical. There's no technical. We just don't have the technical means to get there at the
Mm,
moment. And it might be possible in a few hundred years that we develop that capability, and we can talk about that if you want. But in the near term, the only other planets are the other planets in our solar system, and the only two really are Venus and Mars. I mean, the moon is too small to be terraformed. So I don't know whether all your viewers are familiar with the term terraforming. The word terraforming has been coined to take another planet's environment and make it like the Earth. So that's what terraforming means, because terra means earth in Latin. So Earth forming. So this is what it means. So you take some planet that's not at all like the Earth, like Mars, and make it like the Earth, and then maybe people could live on it. So that's what terraforming means. But in our own solar system, we've only got Mars and Venus. They're very different. They both can be extremely hard to terraform. I think many people would argue that Venus might be impossible. So then that leaves Mars. It would be a process that would take probably thousands of years. It would involve increasing the thickness of the Martian atmosphere, which is currently very thin, carbon dioxide atmosphere. It would mean finding the water, was once on the planet but is no longer on the surface. So that's either escaped to space, which is possible, or it's frozen into the ground, which is also possible. If it's frozen into the ground, then you'd have to huge, I mean, ginormous geoengineering project to melt all that ice and bring the water to the surface of Mars, and a thicker atmosphere. And then you'd have to change the composition of the atmosphere so it was breathable by humans. Now, there is a force that we know does that, can do that, because it's done it on our planet, and it's biology. So you could introduce photosynthesizing organisms which would take the carbon dioxide in Mars's atmosphere and produce oxygen. But and in a sense, the Earth, life on Earth terraformed this planet 2.5 billion years ago, where because I mean Earth too had a CO2 atmosphere, and then it was biology that through photosynthesis that gave us what the 20% of the atmosphere that we now have, which is oxygen. But that takes, I mean, on Earth, that took millions of years. Even if you were trying to speed it up artificially, I mean, it would take thousands of years to make Mars a habitable planet. Even if it's possible. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone agrees that it is possible, but that's what terraforming would involve.
mm. On the question of you mentioned how the best way is able to happen on our planet has been through biology. Is there a way we can, and this is just me kind of like hypothesizing here, is there a way we can, you know, be able to shoot bacteria or like any it's like microbes onto another planet and let it develop over a long period of time for it to create that kind of
Yeah.
environment? And how feasible is that option?
Yes, I think is the answer to that. Again, you depend which planet we were talking about.
Mm,
So you could look at Mars, or you could longer term look at planets orbiting other stars. Yeah, you would learn as much about these environments as you can. And then you would see whether Earth kind of life might be survive on such an environment. And even if it doesn't, our tools now for genetic engineering are becoming so powerful, we could probably genetically engineer something that would survive on a planetary environment. But you don't know how that would turn out, right? I mean, suppose you found a planet with no life, as far as we could judge, with a carbon dioxide atmosphere, and you genetically engineered some microorganisms that could and send them to this planet to start photosynthesizing to convert the CO2 into oxygen. I mean, that is what happened on the Earth 2.5 billion years ago. Well, as far as we know, this life wasn't injected to the Earth from outside, but 2.5 billion years ago, microorganisms on the Earth learned how to photosynthesize and oxygen built up. and then 2 billion years later, here we are. But you wouldn't. There's no way for you to predict what the outcome would be. And obviously, left to those sorts of timescales, it'd be. I mean, it's a timescale that's just outside of the human, not timescale that's so long it's just not really relevant to human beings. The timescale that it would take to terraform a planet that way.
Mm.
But I mean, I don't think it's in. No, I'm sure it's not impossible. But
Yeah.
it begs a question though, and it comes back to governance. I mean, I hate to sort of bring this back to sort of geopolitics and everything, but suppose we do find some planet that we think we could introduce Earth life onto, and let the life evolve there, and then see what happened. I mean, this is a pretty big decision to make. So who is going to make it? I mean, who is responsible for the outcome of this activity? Would some individual billionaire with a big rocket, mentioning no names? I mean, should he or she be able to just start terraforming planets because they want to, or would it be some national government? And my argument is that it would fall in that category that really would require an international government. It would be another of those things where someone or some institution can legitimately speak for the human race as a whole, because that's the kind you're kind of making this decision on behalf of everybody. So I actually think there'll be big ethical questions, but also big political questions behind making a decision to deliberately seed another
Yeah.
planet with life from Earth.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
I'm thinking, the question I have when you mentioned that does that mean that our challenges, although they are kind of enormous about going there, our challenges actually first come from our kind of here. The challenges to even get to that stage where we start looking at, making these decisions, which in the long term could lead to success and discovering other life on other planets, is actually the biggest challenge is actually here. Would you say that, or would you say that actually when we go out there, the challenges there are also just as enormous?
so I think there are multiple challenges. I mean, there's clearly the scientific challenge of finding whether life is out there or not, and that's what the science of astrobiology is all about. And that, I mean, I fully support doing that. Of course, we have to, like I said earlier, unless we search for life, we won't find it. So we have to keep looking. Then there's the engineering challenges of actually getting to these places. Certainly, if we were talking about planets orbiting other stars, I mean, we don't have the capability at the moment, but we might be able to develop it. And then there is the political challenge, yeah, which we're going to have to sort out here, I think, before we start um, moving out too far into the universe. So there are these challenges on multiple fronts, and I think
Mm.
they're all interesting and important challenges, but they're all a bit different from each other.
And looking to the benefits, then, what are some of the tangible benefits that you think if we did complete this terraforming and we had life on other planets, what would life be like? Would we be able to walk around freely like we do here, or would everything be artificial, I suppose?
So that, I mean, again, that depends. For terraforming as it's, you know, to a fully terraformed planet by definition, yeah, it would be such that you'd made another Earth, and human beings could just walk around, breathing and living as we would normally, except of course the gravity would be different. Whatever you do to Mars, you're not going to give it an Earth's gravity. So it's always going to, gravity is always going to be about a third of what it is on the Earth. So that would make a few changes. But I think that's really at the extreme end. I mean, that's so technically difficult, and it would take so long. I mean, I really do think you'd be looking at thousands, could even be millions of years to terraform, get Mars so it's really like the Earth. But of course, there are several halfway stages. I mean, currently, anyone walking around on the surface of Mars will need a spacesuit because the atmospheric pressure is just so thin. And also, the radiation environment is quite bad. So you need some protection from the cosmic rays. But if you made Mars's atmosphere a bit thicker, then this would give protection from the radiation, and you wouldn't need a spacesuit anymore. Maybe you could move around with something like scuba gear instead of a spacesuit. Or you could then take it a bit further. The atmospheric pressure becomes a bit thicker. It's still not really Earth-like, but you could walk around just with a face mask of some kind. So you can see steps along a terraforming route, where before the planet's terraformed at all, yes, if people live there, they'll have to be in underground dwellings or in domes or something because they'd need to be totally shielded from the environment. And then as the process proceeded a bit, they'd be able to venture outside, and the amount of kit they'd need to survive outside would get less and less. Less of a spacesuit, more of a scuba diving gear. And then eventually, thousands of years later, if the atmosphere has really changed to be really Earth-like, they could, take the respirator off and might be able to survive outside without any support. So I think it would be a history, an evolutionary process like that. If this ever happens, I'm not say I don't want to be sound there that I'm necessarily an advocate for terraforming. There are big implications, big ethical implications to terraforming because you would take a planet's environment and totally change it for human benefit. So you could argue that, if the planet had no life of its own, then okay, there might not be a very strong ethical argument not to do this, but you'd need to be very sure. I mean, before we suppose Mars has its own life. I mean, they might only be microorganisms, but it is their planet. So we'd have to be very sure that Mars had no life before we started terraforming it, I think. Otherwise, you're literally committing genocide. You've got a whole independently evolved biosphere, and humans come along and destroy it. I mean, this would be wrong, wouldn't it? I mean, I think it would be wrong. So I'm not necessarily an advocate of terraforming Mars, and certainly not until we have a definite answer to the question of whether Mars has any life of its own.
I completely agree.
Absolutely, absolutely need an answer to that question before we can go any further down this road, I think.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. I think, yeah, there's a lot of like ethical questions that we need to be asked. There's a lot of like conversations that human beings will have to have amongst, even if this is feasible, is it a thing we should do? And I think that's the overall question that I'd like to come back to at the end. But you mentioned time. You mentioned millions of years for us to kind of even get to some of these, or even get to some of these things that we're trying to achieve. Or like on the larger end, I'd say. The question I had is, what role does time play in this? Are we kind of like, are we looking across time as well as space, when in our search for extraterrestrial life? What do you say about that?